Marcus Carter walked slowly through the night as the rain pounded against the streets of Brooklyn, his tired body dragging itself forward after another endless overtime shift that had left his shoulders stiff and his knees burning. He was soaked through, his thin jacket offering no defense against the storm, and his boots slapped against the wet pavement with a rhythm that echoed the exhaustion carved into every bone of his body. His little boy, Eli, rested against his chest, the child's head nestled against his father's neck, fast asleep despite the cold, despite the thunder, despite the fact that Marcus could feel the ache of hunger in his own stomach and knew that Eli must feel it too. The boy was 4 years old, too young to understand how hard his father fought to keep food on the table, too innocent to see the worry behind Marcus's eyes each time he counted coins for rent or checked if the heater would last through another night. For Marcus, every step was heavy, but stopping was not an option because fathers do not stop when their children need them. The bridge stretched ahead like a shadow against the blackened sky, its cables cutting sharp lines through the sheets of rain. Marcus kept his head down, focused on each footstep, whispering silent numbers to himself the way he always did when his thoughts grew too heavy. Rent, groceries, Eli's daycare fee, electricity bill, each number pressed against him like stones piled onto his back, and still he carried on. He had learned long ago that no matter how tired a man became, he must walk, he must keep moving because a child's needs never paused. But tonight, as thunder cracked across the river and lightning split the sky, Marcus's rhythm broke. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the bridge, barely visible through the storm, a figure that did not move like those hurrying to escape the rain. This one was still, too still, the kind of stillness that comes not from patience but from despair. Marcus's heart jolted violently in his chest, his legs stumbling for a step as realization struck. He squinted through the rain and saw her, barefoot, a thin dress clinging to her body, hair plastered across her face as the wind tugged at her frail frame. She stood just beyond the safety of the railing, her toes gripping the slippery steel beam, her hands shaking as they hovered at her sides. The storm raged around her, but it was the emptiness in her posture that shook Marcus most of all. In that moment, fatigue vanished from his body, replaced by a surge of panic that pushed him forward. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, hear the echo of his own voice tearing through the storm as he shouted, "Wait!" The woman turned at the sound, her eyes wide and glistening with tears that blended into the raindrops streaming down her face. For a fraction of a second, their gazes locked, and Marcus saw not just pain but a hollowness so deep it made his stomach twist. Before he could speak again, her foot slipped against the slick beam, and her body pitched forward toward the black, roaring river below. Marcus lunged without thinking, his grip tightening around Eli instinctively before his free arm shot out like a lifeline. His hand closed around her wrist at the very last instant, the force of her fall nearly dragging him over the edge with her. Pain exploded in his knee as it smashed against the steel railing, a crack so sharp it made his stomach lurch, but he refused to release his hold. The storm howled in his ears, Eli's startled cry piercing through the chaos, but Marcus gritted his teeth and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. "Don't move," he gasped, his voice hoarse against the rain. "It's too slippery. I'll lose my grip if you fight me." She twisted weakly, her voice breaking as she cried, "Let me go. I can't take it anymore." The words cut like glass, but Marcus tightened his hold, his arm trembling like a strained cable. "No!" he shouted back, dragging Eli higher against his shoulder to shield him from the rain. "My boy is right here. He's watching, and I won't let him see me let go of someone who needs saving." His chest burned, his muscles screamed, but his resolve dug in deeper than pain could reach. The woman's sobs shook through her body as she dangled, her free arm flailing against the pull of the storm. "I have no one," she cried, her voice trembling with hopelessness. "I lost everything. There's nothing left for me." Marcus's throat constricted as memories he kept buried clawed their way up, images of flames swallowing his old apartment, the sound of his wife's voice calling out one last time, the crushing emptiness of carrying his baby son through smoke with no partner left to lean on. His voice cracked as he rasped, "I lost too. I watched my wife die in a fire. I held my boy in one arm and felt the world fall away from me in the other. But Eli... He tilted his head so she could see the small wet face pressed into his neck. Eli pulled me back. You'll find a reason too, but not if you let go now. Her trembling grew, and Marcus could feel her wrist twitch, a small instinctive movement that told him a spark of life still flickered inside her, no matter how faint. His fingers burned raw against the wetness, but he refused to let the storm decide her fate. He lowered Eli carefully onto the walkway, wrapping his own coat around the boy, whispering for him to stay still, then leaned back over the rail, anchoring himself with every bit of weight and willpower he possessed. Inch by agonizing inch, he pulled, her body scraping against the slick barrier, her sobs rising each time he slipped. At one moment his palm nearly tore free, the steel cutting into his flesh, but he snarled through the pain, "Don't let go. I won't let you fall, but you have to fight with me." Finally, her foot caught against a thin edge of the railing. He saw her eyes widen as if she'd found a small piece of ground to claim. "Push off it," he urged, and as she kicked weakly, he yanked with the last surge of strength left in him. Together, their bodies tumbled backward onto the wet platform, collapsing in a heap of gasping breaths and pounding hearts. For a long moment the storm raged, but neither of them moved, their chests heaving in unison as the reality of what had just happened sank into their bones. The woman curled into his arms, trembling not just from the cold but from the aftershock of almost disappearing into the void. Eli, wide-eyed, crawled toward them, his tiny hand resting on his father's soaked shoulder, like an anchor keeping him grounded. Marcus pressed his cheek against the woman's wet hair, whispering, "You're safe now. You're not alone." She wept into his chest, shaking her head, her voice muffled. "You saved me." He shook his head slowly, pressing his hand against her back. "No, I only reminded you that you're worth saving. You chose to hold on." The storm around them seemed to fade as the three of them huddled together, bound not by blood or promise, but by the fragile thread of a moment when one human being refused to let another vanish. Marcus draped his drenched coat around her shivering shoulders, guiding her gently away from the edge. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. She swallowed, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Ava." She paused, as if saying it aloud for the first time in years, then added, "Ava Whitmore." Marcus nodded slowly, pulling Eli close once again. "I'm Marcus. This is my boy Eli. We can't stay here. Let's get you out of the storm." As they walked together toward the faint light of the street, Marcus's injured knee screamed with every step, but he ignored it, his mind racing with questions about the woman beside him. Her name echoed in his thoughts, unfamiliar yet carrying a weight he did not yet understand. All he knew was that tonight, on this bridge, two broken souls had collided, and something had shifted in the darkness. He did not know then how deeply their lives would entwine, or how much that name, Ava Whitmore, would come to mean in the days to come. The empty chair and the note. The night Marcus pulled Ava back from the edge of the bridge had felt like a storm wrapped in fire, an hour where every second carried the weight of a lifetime, and when he finally guided her to shelter beneath the awning of a small bus stop, he had believed that perhaps the worst was over. She was shivering beneath his coat, clinging to it as though it were the last solid thing she could hold, her eyes unfocused, her body trembling. Eli sat close beside her, his little head resting against her knee as if his small presence might lend her warmth. They had said few words in that fragile silence, and Marcus had made the decision to take her to his old friend Joe Miller, the only man he knew who could be trusted with a night like this. Joe had taken them in without a question, offering towels, tea, and heat. For a few short hours, they had shared something close to peace, a fragile bubble carved out of a storm. But dawn always comes, and with dawn came the emptiness. When Marcus stirred the next morning, his knees stiff and swollen, the room was already quiet. He turned his head to the chair where Ava had been curled the night before, only to find it empty. On the small table lay a folded scarf, Eli's own, neatly placed beside a teacup now cold, and a note written in soft handwriting that seemed almost afraid to exist. Marcus picked it up, his heart already tightening before his eyes scanned the words. "Thank you for not letting go, for reminding me that I'm still human. I need to try standing on my own. I'll be okay." For a long moment he stood frozen, the note trembling in his damp fingers. His chest was a mix of relief and sorrow, a strange ache that whispered of a bond created and broken in the span of one storm. He wanted to chase her, to find her, to demand why she would slip away after being pulled back from the edge. But the reality pressed on him like always. Eli stirred from the couch, whispering, "Daddy?" And that one word was enough to remind Marcus where his duty lay. When he opened his eyes again, he was staring at a ceiling stretched flat and sterile, bright lights humming above him like patient clocks ticking away. The antiseptic sting filled his nostrils, and the steady beep of a heart monitor tethered him to the present. His chest was wrapped tight, his wrist bound in a brace, and every breath sent a spike of fire through his ribs. A nurse explained gently that he had cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and a mild concussion. He would heal, but slowly, and work would not be possible for some time. Marcus's first thought was not of pain, but of Eli. His second was the crushing weight of bills he knew were already stacked on the kitchen table. Joe Miller was there, steady as ever, his broad shoulders carrying the quiet worry of a man who had seen too many broken bodies. "Eli's with me," Joe said, his voice rough but kind. "He calls for you in his sleep, but he's safe. He even gave me one of his toy cars to bring you, said it would keep you from being scared." He placed the small red car in Marcus's palm, and though pain lanced through his ribs as he smiled, he held it tightly, as if it were the strongest medicine he could be given. The first day blurred by in a haze of medication and shallow breaths. The second drifted the same, Marcus fading in and out of sleep, catching only glimpses of footsteps in the hallway, the wheels of gurneys rolling past, the low hum of machines. But on the third morning, as sunlight filtered pale and thin through the hospital blinds, the door to his room opened, a strip of light cut across the floor, and a voice, soft but steady, spoke his name. "Marcus." He turned his head slowly, the movement heavy with the weight of his injuries, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming. There she was, Ava. She stood tall despite the tremor in her hands, her coat a soft cream color against the sterile white of the room, her hair tied back neatly, her eyes glistening as they fixed on him. In her arms she carried a bouquet of blue hydrangeas, their color so vivid it seemed to paint the whole room with life. She moved forward carefully, placing the flowers into a plastic vase by his bed, and when she looked back at him, her smile trembled like a flame fighting wind. "I saw your name in a small article," she said, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break the moment. "The paper said there was an accident at a work site. I came as soon as I could." Her hands folded tightly in her lap as she pulled a chair close, her body leaning forward with the kind of urgency only born from guilt and longing. Marcus stared at her, his throat tight, his mind fighting to catch up with reality. For weeks he had carried her absence like a wound, and now here she was, not a memory, not a ghost, but living, breathing, and close enough to touch. "I thought," he began, but the pain in his ribs cut him off. She shook her head, her voice firm, though her eyes brimmed with unspoken emotion. "I know, I left. I thought it was the only way, but I couldn't stay gone, not after what you did for me." She drew a deep breath, like a diver preparing for deep water, and then she said the words that shifted everything once again. "There's something I didn't tell you that night. My full name is Ava Whitmore. Henry Whitmore is my father." Marcus blinked, his body going rigid despite the pain that flared in his chest. The name was not unfamiliar. Henry Whitmore, the tycoon, the empire builder, the man whose face filled magazines and whose towers cut across the city skyline. Ava saw the recognition in his eyes and gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "Yes, that Whitmore. The name heavy enough to smother me. The name that made me invisible even as it put me on every headline. I grew up in a world where image was everything and emotions were stains to be scrubbed out." She brushed her fingers against the white bedsheet, her gaze distant. But that night, in the rain, you had nothing but your child, and the strength to hold on, and still you saw me. You didn't see Whitmore. You saw Ava. And I never forgot that. Marcus turned his head away, swallowing the knot in his throat, his voice rough when it finally broke through. You don't have to. But she cut him off, her voice sharp, certain, stronger than he had ever heard it. I want to. Let me stay. At least for these days while you heal, while you can't lift Eli without wincing. Let me do something real. And in that sterile hospital room with monitors beeping and sunlight pressing through blinds, Marcus realized that the storm from that night on the bridge was not over. It had only been waiting, circling back, bringing with it a truth he had not expected. The woman he had pulled back from the edge was not just a lost soul, but the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the city. And now she was sitting at his side, asking to stay. The return of Ava. The days that followed her sudden return blurred into something Marcus had not expected. In his mind, Ava Whitmore was still the fragile shadow on the bridge, a young woman clinging to the edge of despair. But the Ava who sat by his bedside in the hospital was something different. She was still fragile in plow. He could see it in the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching, in the way her eyes sometimes drifted to the window as if searching for something far away. But there was also a new strength in her, a resolve that had not been there that stormy night. She arrived each morning quietly, often before the nurses made their rounds, carrying small things that seemed simple but meant the world to Marcus. Some mornings it was soup she had taught herself to make by calling old cooks who had worked in her father's kitchens. Some days it was a cushion she had found at a second-hand store to help keep his ribs aligned. Sometimes it was only herself, sitting silently with a book in her lap, her presence filling the space like sunlight that didn't need to announce itself. Eli came to visit in the afternoons, holding tightly to Joe Miller's hand as they walked the sterile hallways, his small eyes lighting up the moment he spotted his father. He would scramble onto the bed carefully, mindful of the bandages, and place his toy car on Marcus's stomach with a proud grin. But one afternoon he turned to Ava, his little face tilting with recognition. "Are you the Miss Ava from the bridge?" he asked innocently, his voice ringing through the quiet room. Ava's eyes glistened as she nodded, her lips curving into a trembling smile. "Yes, Eli. That was me." The boy's grin widened, his small arms wrapping around her waist as if he had already decided she belonged to them. "You came back," he whispered, and in that moment, something fragile inside her seemed to crack open, replaced by warmth. When Eli returned home with Joe each evening, the room shrank back to just two people and the sound of steady beeping from the monitor. It was in those hours that Ava and Marcus began to talk, not of shallow things, but of truths that had been buried too long. Marcus told her pieces of his story, his years as a firefighter, the fire that had taken his wife, the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. Ava, in turn, told him pieces of hers, of a childhood in a mansion that had felt more like a museum, of a father who measured love in terms of usefulness, of an engagement arranged not for her happiness, but for the benefit of alliances. She spoke of painting, of colors that lived inside her mind, but were dismissed as childish by the only parent she had left. Each confession felt like peeling away layers of armor, and though Marcus often fell silent, uncomfortable with being seen so clearly, he could not deny that Ava's presence eased the weight on his chest in ways medicine never could. The hospital bills, however, told a harsher story. One afternoon, Ava spread them across the small table by his bed, her brow furrowed as she looked at the impossible numbers. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs. "Leave it, I'll pay them." Ava lifted her eyes, frowning. "Marcus, these bills—" He cut her off, his tone firm though soft. "I'll pay them off. Not because I can afford it easily, but because I need to. I owe, I pay. Not to prove anything to you, not to prove to anyone else, but because I have to keep my back straight in front of my son. Eli has to see that dignity matters. For a long moment Ava stared at him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then she quietly closed the ledger, pressing her palm against it as if sealing the moment shut. That evening when she left, she slipped a crumpled envelope into her sketch folder. Inside was $45 in cash, the slanting handwriting on the note beside it reading, "For the hospital, I'll pay the rest, piece by piece. Promise. M." When she read it in the elevator, tears burned her eyes, not for the small sum itself, but for what it represented. In her world, money was a weapon, a leash, a measure of power. For Marcus, it was dignity, hard-earned and never surrendered. That difference shook her to her core. As the days passed, their bond grew not in dramatic declarations, but in small, steady moments. Ava brought crayons and paper one morning, setting them in front of Eli when he visited. The boy sat cross-legged at the foot of the bed, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration as he drew 3 stick figures. He held up the paper proudly. "This is Daddy, this is me, and this is Mommy Ava." The room fell silent, the weight of the child's innocent words hanging in the air like a held breath. Ava bit her lip, her hands trembling as she took the paper, staring at the simple lines that somehow carried more truth than any speech could. Marcus coughed softly, trying to mask the surge of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He knew Eli missed a mother's presence. He knew his son's innocent heart wanted to fill that void with the woman who had come into their lives like lightning. Ava stroked Eli's hair gently, whispering, "Thank you for the drawing, champ." Her voice shook, but there was a softness in her eyes that Marcus had never seen before. One evening after Joe had taken Eli home, Marcus and Ava found themselves alone in the quiet room, the scent of tomato soup drifting from a container she had brought. Marcus shifted uncomfortably against the pillows, his ribs aching, his voice low. "I don't want." He trailed off, unsure of how to say the words. Ava turned to him, her gaze steady. "I know. You don't want to rush a name. You don't want to promise what you can't. But feelings, they're hard to fake, Marcus." His jaw tightened, his hand resting on the worn counter beside the bed. "Yeah, real feelings should stay real." For a moment, the silence between them was filled with something heavier than words, something that hovered in the air like the first spark of a fire. The next day, the storm hit. Not a storm of rain this time, but of headlines. A tabloid photo splashed across the city. A grainy shot of Ava Whitmore holding Eli at the boarding house door, the hallway light casting shadows across their faces, their eyes red from the flash. The caption screamed across the front page, "Heiress Ava Whitmore, living with single dad in Brooklyn." The image spread like wildfire, whispered in boardrooms, muttered on sidewalks, replayed on television screens. Ava's name, once associated only with wealth and privilege, was now tied to a story that shocked the city. Marcus sat in the hospital bed, the paper trembling in his hand as he read the words. His chest tightened, his stomach churning. He knew what it meant. The Whitmore name was not just a name, it was power, it was scrutiny, it was a tidal wave that could crush anyone caught beneath it. He looked at Ava, whose face was pale but resolute. Her father would see this, the world would see this, and nothing would ever be the same again. Clash of worlds. The newspaper headlines spread faster than the winter winds. By noon the photographs were everywhere, on Subway State. NDS in the hands of commuters, flashing across news tickers. Ava Whitmore, daughter of Henry Whitmore, the man whose empire of steel and glass stretched across cities, had been found not in the glittering towers of wealth, but at the side of a single father in a cramped Brooklyn boarding house. The media swirled like vultures, each headline sharper than the last, each whisper painting its own story. Some called it scandal, others called it rebellion, but no matter the angle, it was fire, and the Whitmore name was the kind that burned hottest when exposed. Marcus had known trouble was coming the moment he saw the grainy photo on the front page. His gut twisted with unease as he stared at the frozen image of Ava holding Eli in her arms, the flash making their eyes glow strangely, the doorway behind them a shadowy frame that made it all look like some forbidden secret. Marcus folded the paper slowly, his chest heavy. He was not a man unfamiliar with storms, but this was different. This was not fire he could fight with water, nor a fall he could brace against. This was power, and power, he knew, did not forgive. He didn't have to wait long. That evening the storm came in the form of polished leather shoes clicking against the warped wooden floor of Joe Miller's home. The door swung open, and with it entered the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself. Henry Whitmore stood tall, his coat immaculate, his silver hair slicked perfectly, his eyes sharp as cold steel. Behind him trailed two lawyers, their briefcases clutched like weapons, their faces expressionless. The small warmth of Joe's living room seemed to shrink beneath the weight of their arrival. Ava froze when she saw him, her body stiffening as if she were a child again, caught doing something forbidden. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Marcus stood slowly from the couch, ignoring the throb. In his ribs, his gaze locking on the man whose shadow filled the room. For a long moment silence hung heavy, then Henry's voice, calm but cutting, sliced through it. "Ava, we are leaving." Ava shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. "No, Father, I'm not leaving." Henry's jaw tightened, the barest flicker of surprise passing over his features before his mask of control returned. He stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the worn furniture, the chipped walls, the sight of Eli clutching Marcus's leg. Disgust flickered in his eyes, though he hid it beneath polished words. "This is beneath you. Whatever fantasy you think you are living here, it ends tonight. Your place is not in this." His hand gestured vaguely at the room, as if even naming it might dirty his tongue. Marcus felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he forced his voice steady. "With all respect, sir, she's not a possession to be dragged back to a place she doesn't want to be. She has the right to decide where she belongs." Henry's gaze snapped to him, cold and unyielding. "And who are you to speak of rights? A laborer, a man who can barely keep his child fed. Do not mistake one night of charity for worthiness. My daughter's life is not something you can play house with." The words cut deep, but Marcus did not flinch. He straightened slowly, his ribs aching, but his back unbending. "You think because I don't have money, I don't have worth. You think because my home is small, love cannot live here. But I'll tell you something, Mr. Whitmore. Love is not measured by the size of a bank account or the shine of a tower. Love is staying when it hurts. Love is giving your coat away in a storm, even if it's the only one you have. Love is waking up every morning to fight again, not because you have to, but because someone is counting on you. That's something no fortune can buy, and it's something your daughter deserves." Ava's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Marcus, her father's words clashing against his like steel striking stone. For the first time in her life, someone was standing up not only for her, but with her. Her voice shook but grew stronger as she faced Henry. "Father, I'm not leaving. Not this time. You told me once that love was about being useful, about being a piece on your board. But that's not love. That's control. I've lived my whole life under your rules, but for the first time, I found something real. I found people who see me, not the name, not the legacy, just me. And I won't let you take that away." The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their pens poised but hesitant, as though even they felt the weight of her words. Henry's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You think this man can protect you? You think he can shield you from what comes when the world learns that Ava Whitmore has thrown herself away for a nobody? You are naive, child. You don't understand the cost." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady, unwavering. "Then let the cost fall on me. I've carried worse. I've carried fire. I've carried grief. I've carried nights where the weight of the world sat on my shoulders, and I still stood because my boy needed me. If your world thinks less of her because she chooses something real, then it's your world that's broken, not her." For the first time, Henry faltered. Not much, not enough to break the mask entirely, but enough for Ava to see it. A crack, a hesitation, a glimpse of the man behind the empire, but it lasted only a second. He straightened, his voice clipped. "Very well. If you insist on playing this game, then understand. There are consequences, and they will not fall on me." His gaze shifted deliberately to Marcus, then to Eli, and though he said nothing more, the threat was clear. With a sharp turn, he swept from the room, his lawyers following like shadows. The door closed with a heavy finality that left the air vibrating. Silence stretched in the wake of his departure. Ava's body trembled, her hands clenching at her sides. Marcus exhaled slowly, the fire in his chest still burning. Eli pressed against his leg, sensing the tension, but not understanding the storm of power and fear that had just passed through their lives. Joe Miller finally spoke from his chair in the corner, his voice calm but edged with warning. "That man doesn't lose easily. He'll come back. And next time he'll bring more than words." Marcus nodded, his jaw set. He knew Joe was right. Power never walked away quietly, and Henry Whitmore was not a man accustomed to defeat. But as he looked at Ava, at the way her shoulders straightened despite her trembling, at the way her eyes held not fear but determination, Marcus also knew something else. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The next week proved Joe's words true. Marcus returned to the construction site only to find whispers among the workers, the foreman avoiding his eyes. By the end of the day, his name was scratched from the schedule. No explanation, no reason, just the quiet dismissal of a man who could no longer afford to keep him on. Word had spread. No one wanted the risk of angering the Whitmore empire. By the end of the week, every odd job he had counted on had dried up. Doors closed. Calls went unanswered. The weight of bills grew heavier, and each night Marcus sat in the dim light, his son asleep on his chest, wondering how much longer he could hold the line. Yet even in the darkness there were sparks. Ava stayed, refusing to retreat, her presence a quiet rebellion against the world she had left behind. She cooked meals from scratch, fumbling but determined, laughed softly at Eli's endless questions, and brought warmth into corners Marcus had thought forever cold. Each night she sat beside him, sometimes talking, sometimes only silent, but always there. It was not grand gestures or dramatic vows, it was presence, steady and unyielding, and in that Marcus found strength. But storms do not end with one battle, and as winter deepened, Marcus knew the worst was yet to come, because when a man like Henry Whitmore felt his control slipping, he did not simply walk away, he tightened his grip, and the next time he returned, it would not be with words, but with power sharp enough to cut through everything they had built. Breaking point and breakthrough, winter dragged on with a bitterness that seemed intent on testing every ounce of Marcus's strength. The cold seeped into the walls of Joe's boarding house, into Marcus's bones, into the little cracks of his spirit that he tried so hard to hide from Eli and Ava. With his job gone and the list of unpaid bills piling higher each week, Marcus found himself staring at the ceiling at night, wondering how long a man could endure before the world simply swallowed him whole. He had always survived by working harder than his pain, but now, no matter how many doors he knocked on or how many hours he offered, no one wanted to hire him. Every whisper of his name was followed by the shadow of Henry Whitmore. It was not spoken aloud, but it was there in the hesitation of foremen, in the polite refusals of shop owners, in the way his phone remained silent after sending applications. The empire had spoken without words. Marcus Carter would not be allowed to work in this city. Ava saw it in his shoulders, in the way he carried the weight of each day heavier than the one before, and though she tried to offer comfort, Marcus's pride bristled like a wounded animal. When she reached into her savings to pay for groceries, he would thank her but grow quiet, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding hers. When she tried to slip money toward the rent, he pushed it back into her hands, muttering, "I won't let my boy see me live off someone else's charity." She wanted to scream at him that it wasn't charity, that it was partnership, that it was what people did when they loved each other, but she also knew Marcus was a man who built his dignity from the ground up, and stripping that away would be worse than hunger. So she stayed, cooking meals from scratch, selling sketches in the market when she could, doing what she could without breaking his sense of honor. And every night she whispered prayers she had never believed in before, asking that tomorrow would bring him a chance. Joe, with his years of wisdom, finally pulled Marcus aside one evening, his rough voice steady as he spoke. "You've carried this boy through fire. You've carried grief that would break most men. But Marcus, sometimes strength isn't in carrying alone. Sometimes strength is letting others carry a piece for you. Marcus stared at him, frustration sparking in his chest, but Joe's eyes didn't waver. Your son is watching. Let him see that real men don't drown in pride. Real men build bridges with others when the storm rises too high. The words cut deep because Marcus knew they were true. But knowing and accepting were oceans apart, and he was still learning how to swim. One night, as the snow fell heavy and silent, Ava sat at the table with Marcus, her hands curled around a mug of tea, her eyes searching his. "If I could," she said softly, "I'd open a small studio. Nothing grand, nothing like my father's towers, just a place where people who feel broken could come and paint, or just breathe, a place for those who've seen too much. I always thought my life had to mean numbers and contracts, but what I want is a space for healing, a space for color." Marcus looked at her, the exhaustion in his eyes softening into something gentler. "Sounds right for you," he said quietly. Then after a pause, she asked, "And you? If you could start over?" He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "A patch of grass where Eli can run barefoot. A kitchen where dinner doesn't come from counting coins. And maybe someone who listens at the end of the day. Nothing more, nothing less." Their eyes met across the dim light, and for a fleeting moment it felt as though their dreams had intertwined into something more than survival. But life has a way of testing fragile hopes. It was a night like any other, the snow pressing against the window panes, the heater struggling, when Eli began to cough. At first it was small, a dry sound Marcus barely noticed, but soon it grew deeper, sharper, the kind of cough that left the little boy gasping for breath. Panic rushed through Marcus like fire. He lifted Eli into his arms, feeling the heat of fever burning through the boy's small body. "Daddy, it hurts," Eli whispered, his voice hoarse, and Marcus's chest nearly shattered. He had faced flames and collapsing buildings, but nothing had ever terrified him like the sight of his son's flushed cheeks and glassy eyes. Without hesitation, Marcus bundled Eli in blankets, his hands shaking as he shouted for Ava and Joe. The snowstorm outside was merciless, the streets coated in ice, but Marcus didn't care. With Eli cradled against his chest, he pushed into the night, Ava at his side, Joe following close behind. The wind cut like knives, the snow blinding, but all Marcus could hear was his son's weak voice. All he could feel was the rapid heat against his skin. His knee screamed in pain with every step, his ribs aching, but he pressed forward toward the hospital lights glowing faintly in the distance like a beacon. Inside the emergency room, chaos surrounded them. Nurses rushing, stretchers wheeling past, the smell of antiseptic filling the air. A doctor took Eli from his arms, asking questions Marcus could barely process through his panic. "How long has he had the fever? Has he been exposed to anyone sick? Does he have insurance?" Marcus stammered, answering what he could, his pride cracking as he admitted, "No insurance. I'll pay whatever it takes. Just help my boy." Papers were shoved toward him, numbers and terms that blurred together, but all Marcus cared about was the sight of Eli being carried into a room, his small hand reaching back, his voice faint. "Daddy, don't leave me." The weight of those words crushed Marcus more than any debt ever could. He sank into a chair, his hands pressed over his face, his body trembling. Ava sat beside him, her hand slipping into his, her voice steady. "He's strong, Marcus, just like you. He'll fight through this." But Marcus's voice broke as he whispered, "What if he doesn't? What if I can't protect him? I promised him I'd never let him feel alone, and now—" His words faded, choked by fear. Ava squeezed his hand tighter. "You are here. That's what matters. You didn't walk away. You didn't let go. And he knows that. That's what saves children. Marcus, not money, not power. Love saves them." Hours stretched like days as they waited. Each tick of the clock was another test of Marcus's endurance, another stone placed on his chest. The bills would be impossible, the future uncertain, But in that waiting room, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the small boy fighting in the room beyond those doors, the boy who had already taught his father that even broken men could find reasons to keep standing. And then, finally, a doctor stepped out, his expression unreadable. He held a chart in his hand, his eyes scanning the tired faces before him. "Mr. Carter," he began, and Marcus's heart clenched in his chest. The room seemed to tilt, the sounds around him fading into silence. Everything hung on the next words, every hope, every prayer, every breath. Ava's hand tightened on his, Joe's steady presence at his back. The doctor drew a breath, preparing to speak.